Welcome to this short video that's going to briefly outline some aspects of anatomical terminology. So on the screen at the moment we have a picture of a person who's in the anatomical position. Now the anatomical position is an important position as we use it and various other terms to help describe the location of various organs. And what we have here in the anatomical position is the person looking forwards with the head fixed, both arms lying either side of the trunk with their palms turned forwards, their legs together and their feet and toes also pointing forwards. And this we call the anatomical position. Using this position, we can also use pairs of adjectives which can be used to describe the relationship of parts of the body in the anatomical position and also compare the position of two structures relative to each other. So for example, we can use the terms anterior and posterior. Anterior refers to structures that are towards the front of the body. So here we can have anterior. So we're looking directly here at the anterior surface. Structures that are more towards the back of the body are referred to as posterior. So here we have the anterior and posterior. Anterior towards the front of the body, posterior towards the back of the body. An example of using this terminology are the toes are anterior to the ankle. And so the ankle is posterior to the toes. If you have a basic grasp of human anatomy, then you could also say that the heart is anterior to the vertebral column, and the vertebral column is posterior to the heart. We can also use the terms superior and inferior. If a structure is superior, it's orientated more towards the top of the skull. So here we have superior. If a structure is positioned more towards the sole of the foot, then it's referred to as inferior. Some examples of using superior and inferior is the heart is superior to the stomach, or the stomach is inferior to the heart. Here we could use the nipples are superior to the umbilicus, or the umbilicus is inferior to the nipples. A further pair of adjectives we can use are medial and lateral. Now medial and lateral refers to the position of a structure in relation to the midline of the person. So if a structure is said to be medial, then it is closer to the midline. If a structure is said to be lateral, then it is further away from the midline. So again we could say the left arm is lateral to the trunk, or we could say the eyes are lateral to the nose, or the nose is medial to the eye. So medial and lateral refers to the relative position of a structure in relation to an imaginary midline drawn down the middle of the body. And also we could use the terms proximal and distal. And if a structure within, say, this upper limb is closer to the trunk, then we call it proximal. If it's further away from the trunk, then we call it distal. So here we have distal and proximal. An example of this is the hand being distal to the elbow joint, or the shoulder being proximal to the elbow. So we can see here with pairs of adjectives we can describe the position of structures relative to other structures using the anatomical position. So we've used anterior and posterior, superior and inferior, medial and lateral, proximal and distal. So if you're happy with these terms, then we can move on to looking at how we can section the body in various planes. To detail the 3 anatomical planes you should be aware of, I'm going to use some jelly babies. The 3 planes are the median or sagittal, coronal and transverse. So to start off with, let's just look at our jelly baby and see how it mirrors the anatomical position of the human. So here we have the head end and we have the feet here. We have the arms either side of the trunk and the legs are close together, and the eyes within the face are facing forward. So here we have the anterior surface and here we have the posterior surface. If we start by detailing the median plane, then this is going to be a vertical plane that passes through the body and divides it into left and right halves. It goes through the anterior and posterior surfaces. So if we were to section this jelly baby in the median plane, then we'd section it through the anterior and posterior surfaces, so we have two left and right halves. So here we can see we have the left half, and here we can see we have the right half. So we've sectioned this jelly baby in the median plane. If this was going to be in the sagittal plane, then it would be a similar vertical section through the anterior and posterior surfaces, but it would be parallel to the left or right of the median plane. So the median plane is directly in the midline through the anterior and posterior surfaces, and the sagittal plane would be parallel to this median plane through again the posterior and anterior surfaces. When referencing to a sagittal section, you need to identify at which level you sectioned it, say mid-clavicular level for example. So that's the median and the sagittal plane. If we then to go and turn to another jelly baby, we can describe the coronal plane, and to do this we need to turn our jelly baby to the side so we can clearly see the anterior surface here and the posterior surface here. Now if the median plane was going through this direction, the coronal plane is going to go at a right angle and separate it into anterior and posterior sections. So a coronal section would be through the jelly baby to create both a posterior and an anterior section. So here with our coronal section we can see we have both an anterior and a posterior section. It goes at right angles to the median plane, and again you need to be clear at what level did you section it coronally. How posterior were you and how anterior were you? But here we have the coronal section. And then finally we have the transverse section, and the transverse section is a horizontal section across the jelly baby in this direction, so we could have a transverse section like this, and then we could look up at this cut surface. Again, it's vitally important when making this transverse section to be aware of at which level the section was made. And to do this, we usually refer to the vertebral column. So it was a horizontal or a transverse section at, say, T12, the 12th thoracic vertebra, or in the neck and, say, C4 at the level of the 4th cervical vertebra. So here we have the transverse section, a horizontal section across the jelly baby. Here we have our coronal section, which created anterior and posterior sections, and then we had our median section where we formed left and right halves. So the median, coronal and transverse planes.